and a candy man. Like a freight train rolling, bringing truth bombs down the line. Promoting the Southland 1 week at a time. Promoting the Southland 1 week at a time. SCV Chat starts now.
Like right now? Like right now?
Yeah, we're live right now.
Right. Anyway, good evening, everybody. Views and opinions expressed in this broadcast are not necessarily those of the SCV, HGC, or any division camps, division brigades camps, or other subsidiaries. Sorry, I kind of got stuck in the loop there. I was sending some WORK related emails before the pre-show, so I didn't get to say hi, Michael, but hi, Michael. But I did get to type it in. If you are joining us, then you are our historical talk, first Monday of the month, continuing on with our themes, heroes of our heroes, the American Revolution, all Southern aspects dealing with that, things that inspired our ancestors in 1861 to declare independence like their ancestors did in 1776. Because the South was right in 61, because America was right. Miss anything?
No, that's great. That's a great start right there.
Yeah, besides getting stuck in the groove. Anyway, we're back talking about a very important Southerner, like we always do. Tonight, we're talking about the Swamp Fox himself, Francis Marion. Moose, before we into it, any announcements you need?
No, remind everybody that Commander's Comments is this Thursday, and this is officially the start of April, Confederate History Month, and SCV Chat's got a lot of stuff greatly planned. And we hope to also unveil the website later on this month, too. So we got a lot of great things coming in store for y'all.
Yes, a lot of great things. Mediocre things that we think are great. So,
oh, yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, because renowned figure and one of our favorite historians, Michael C. Hardy, you can check out his historical talks on Sunday on his Facebook page, as well as check out his blog, where he has so many great and interesting blog posts about. We're going to go ahead and you already unmuted him, and we're going to
I unmuted me.
Take it away. Oh, you unmuted?
That's an update.
Yeah. Michael, thank you for being on the show. Let's talk. Let's chat.
Sure. So we're going to talk about Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. For most of the folks, I see popping up in the comments, they know about the Swamp Fox. I think if it's okay with y'all this evening, I'm going to start in reverse. Start in reverse. For some of the folks that are popping up in our chat this evening, it's hard to say this these days, but for some of the folks popping up in our chat this evening, Walt Disney played a huge role in their interest in American history. Now, when some of y'all think of Walt Disney, you think of Snow White, the Seven Dwarfs. I don't know. One of the dwarfs may be with us this evening. I'm not sure. You think about Cinderella. Some of y'all think about Dumbo. Maybe for some of y'all younger folks, you think about the Star Wars franchise. But Disney in the 1950s and 1960s was telling or retelling or maybe repackaging some of the most important pieces of American history. Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, the Great Locomotive Chase, Along the Oregon Trail, Texas John Slaughter, which is based on a Texas Ranger, John Horton Slaughter, Johnny Tremaine, which takes place in Boston there at the beginning of the American Revolution, Daniel Boone, Johnny Shiloh, which is based on Johnny Clem, the Union soldier boy. And then in 1959 to 1960, we get the Swamp Fox. Some of y'all, a few of you, maybe even humming that tune from the Disney series right now. If you don't know it, go look it up. There were 8 Swamp Fox episodes that Disney did. Brother Against Brother, Tory Vengeance, Horses for Green. You can find all of these on YouTube, and you can go check it out. Now, is there a lot of leeway in the story that they're telling there? Sure, there sure is. But for so many people, stuff like that, for so many people of a certain age demographic, that is their introduction to history. And for a few of y'all, it may have ignited their passion into history. That series, those different episodes that Disney did. For decades, Francis Marion was right up there in the pantheon of heroes from the American Revolution. There are 14 different states that have towns or cities named for Francis Marion. In fact, in the county just south of me is Marion, North Carolina, which is named for Francis Marion. There are 16 different states that have counties named for Francis Marion. There is a Francis Marion National Forest near Charleston, Francis Marion University in Florence, South Carolina. Marion Park is one of the 4 major parks in Washington, D.C. Marion was inducted into the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame, of course, much later in life. And there was even a U.S. naval vessel named for Francis Marion. Maybe South Carolina's educational system is better than the rest of the country's, which I doubt. But we don't really hear anything about Francis Marion these days. It's just not out there. So for the next few minutes, we're not going to try and cover his entire life, but we're going to talk about a few episodes, a few high points in his life. And if you're interested, and I'll go ahead and mention this, if you're interested, I like Hugh Rankin's book on Francis Marion better than, I can't say better than the rest, and maybe because I read that when I was younger, but it's a good almost 400-page biography on Francis Marion. So the facts, maybe. Marion was born circa 1732 in Berkeley County, South Carolina, and around the age of 15, he decides to set out and see the world. He signs on a merchant ship bound for the West Indies. I can't imagine my 15 or 16-year-old saying, "See ya, I'm going to go sailing for a while." But he did. And he was not out to sea just a few days, and his ship sinks. And he spends a week in a lifeboat until somebody comes along and finally picks them and a few of the other sailors up. And I don't remember ever reading Marion going to sea again after that. I guess that was enough ocean life for him to cure him of that idea. We do know that Marion served in the South Carolina militia during the French and Indian War, fighting in a little piece of that war that is sometimes called the Cherokee Uprising or the Anglo-Cherokee War of 1758 to 1761. American Revolution comes along, and Marion starts out as a captain in the 2nd South Carolina Regiment of the Continental Army. He is there with Colonel Moultrie, building Fort Sullivan and then defending Fort Sullivan when the British come and attack about June 1776. In September of 1776, he is commissioned lieutenant colonel by the Continental Congress, and in 1779 takes part in a failed attempt to rescue Savannah, Georgia. that had been captured by the British. And that right there really sums up Marion's first 4 years during the American Revolution. March 1780 is when it really starts to get exciting. Marion is at a dinner party, and he finds that the host, which is common in that time period, well, let me say this: they give a lot of toast at these dinner parties, and they will toast, certain leaders, political leaders, and other things, and they're like sometimes a dozen different toasts. And Marion is not a drinking man. And I have read that it was common in the time period for the host to lock the doors when they start doing the toast. I didn't plan to say it that way. That's just the way it worked out. So they lock the doors and the toast have started. And Marion, not being a drinking man, jumps out of a window on the second floor story of the house that they are in. And when he lands, he breaks his ankle. And Marion leaves town to recuperate in the country. And then just a few days after this, the British show up and lay siege to Charleston. And Major General Benjamin Lincoln, commanding the Charleston garrison, surrenders his forces to the British. It is considered by some one of the worst American defeats of the war, of the American Revolution. Then Lord Cornwallis enters the scene. We've got other Patriot defeats like Monk's Corner and the Waxhaws. And the war in the South is just not looking all that good. It's really not. So Morgan, even with his bad ankle, starts to organize small groups of men. Anywhere, I've seen numbers, as low as 20 to all the way up to 200. And I'm sure these men would come and go as opportunity would allow them. But they start conducting small raids against the British. Now, because of a clash with General Horatio Gates, Marion misses the Battle of Camden, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
But Marion is out there, and he's making these small raids, and a lot of times he has a lot of really good success, even though his men are hungry and often low on ammunition. The British never really know where Marion will pop up. And so to protect their lines of supplies in these small garrisons, Marion starts to, or the British start to spread their men out. So they're not as an effective fighting force because they're spread out all over the place trying to protect these lines, especially their lines of resupply. In August of 1780, Marion attacks an enemy encampment from behind and rescues 150 prisoners. So his name is starting to get out there among other Patriot forces commanders, and he's starting to make a name against the British. It's in November of 1780 that Marion earns the nickname we know him by today, which is the Swamp Fox. British Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, informed of Marion's whereabouts by an escaped prisoner, chases the American militia for hours, 7 hours, according to one source that I read, covering some 26 miles. Marion escaped into a swamp, and Tarleton gave up. In fact, I was reading, I have one of the books I have on Francis Marion is a kid's book, and didn't quite quote it this way, but it talks about how Marion has slipped over into the swamp. He's on his island there, and he's watching the British from the shade of a tree, and it's foggy in the swamp, painting a really cool picture. And Tarleton's men have ridden into the swamp, and the horses have started to sink to their knees, and finally Tarleton gives up. And one source says that Tarleton, quote, says this. He says, "As for this damned old fox, the devil himself couldn't catch him." That story got around, and locals hear about it, and that's how the Swamp Fox gets its name. Now, there are a couple of different variations of that story, but that's how Tarleton gave Francis Marion the nickname the Swamp Fox. He would eventually be commissioned a brigadier general of state troops by Governor John Rutledge. He not only engaged in all of this guerrilla warfare, he was also an intelligence officer for Nathaniel Greene in December 1780, 1781, on into 1782. How often did the Swamp Fox and Tarleton meet during the war? That's a great question, and I'm not sure we'll ever know the exact answer to that question. Tarleton and Marion are very crafty. I think that the cat and mouse game played at Richardson's plantation in November of 1781 is a good example. Both of them were trying to lure the other one into an ambush, and Tarleton even went as far as to build big fires, so Marion would think that the Richardson's plantation was on fire, and he would come to the rescue. And Marion almost did. He had his men close by, and there was a federal office, or a federal. Sorry, wrong war. There was a Patriot officer who had come sneaking into Marion's position and said, "Look, they drastically outnumber you. They have 400 men. Marion supposedly had around 100 men, and they have 2 cannons." And Francis Marion and his men were probably within half an hour of launching an attack. And so Marion slipped off into the night, and Tarleton tried to follow him, but never in that case never could link up and make contact. Following the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March of 1781, Marion and the other Patriot groups began eliminating British strongholds in South Carolina. The first to fall was Fort Watson in April of 1781. Fort Mott fell in May of that year. Because of the damage that Marion and Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee did to supply lines, they forced Francis, Lord Rawdon, to evacuate Camden. Marion also collected foodstuffs for Greene's army as they pursued the British forces from 96 toward Charleston. And I don't recall any of my ancestors that served with Marion, but I did have an ancestor on the Patriot side at 96, a little earlier to that time period. In January of 1782, Marion was elected to the South Carolina General Assembly, and he left his troops to take up his seat. And there is some things going on with Marion's men at this point in time that they kind of start to fall apart after that event, after Francis Marion takes up that position. But the war is close to being over. Toward the end of 1782, the British Parliament suspends offensive operations in America, and in December, the British withdraw from Charleston, and the Treaty of Paris brings the war pretty much to an end. What does Marion discover at this point in time? His house has been destroyed by the British. And so he rebuilds his home, he gets married, and goes on to serve several terms in the South Carolina State Senate. He dies in 1795 at the age of 63. So then, have either of you ever heard of Oscar Marion?
I've not.
Okay. Oscar Marion was, as the story goes, one of the slaves owned by Francis Marion. And Oscar and the Swamp Fox fought side by side throughout much of the war. He was Marion's aide, his servant, his chef, his bugler, his oarsman, etc. And I discovered that in 2006, U.S. President George W. Bush recognized Oscar as a, quote, African-American patriot. Big ceremony and everything. So something I didn't know until earlier today, and I actually, if you go check out my blog, Looking for the Confederate War, you can read a little bit more about this. But Francis and Oscar Marion both appear on a Confederate $10 note. Did you know
Really? I did not know that.
I didn't know that. Now, I have written once about Confederate currency, talking about Lucy Pickens. I think it was Lucy Pickens, and how she's the first woman to appear on an American banknote, Confederate note, national note. But both Francis and Oscar Marion are on a Confederate $10 piece. As the story goes, Revolutionary War General Francis Marion and his men had their secret headquarters there in the South Carolina swamp, where they would launch those frequent attacks. On one occasion, a British officer wanting to exchange prisoners, or the British wanting to exchange prisoners, sent an officer to confer with General Marion under a flag of truce. Well, Marion didn't want the British officer to learn where his camp was there in the swamp, so they blindfolded the officer and led him into camp. When the blindfold was removed, the British officer was surprised not to find himself in a tent or a dwelling, but in a clearing in the midst of this dense and swampy woods. General Marion stepped forward and politely offered him a seat on a nearby log. The British officer was even shocked at, Marion was not a big man. They expected some big hulking guy who, this guy who had wreaked all this havoc with their supply lines and their forces. Nope, Marion was a little fella. When they finally concluded their business, Marion invited the British officer to have dinner with him. The officer was wondering where the dining room could be when one of Marion's men approached him carrying a piece of bark on which there were some sweet potatoes that had been roasted on the campfire. Marion helped his guest to a sweet potato and began to eat one himself with apparent gusto. The British officer followed Marion's example, and in the course of table talk, learned that the daily routine of Marion and his men, and he learned that Marion was an officer who served without pay or salary, as did the men under his command. He also observed the good spirits of the soldiers, and upon his return to British headquarters, we are told, this may be apocryphal, but we are told that the British officer resigned his commission, saying he would have no further share in depriving such brave and courteous men as Marion the rights that were due to them. So in 1840, a painter who painted this image of the British officer and Francis Marion and Oscar kneeling down by the fire cooking those sweet potatoes. The painting was turned into an engraving, and that engraving appeared on an 1861 $10 note, Confederate note. The painting now was purchased by the federal government. It hung in the U.S. Senate building for a while, in the office building, I think it was. It is now on loan to a museum in Florence for much of 2023. So I'm going to try and get down there and check that out. So that is a little about Francis Marion.
Yeah, well, the things that I found interesting in my research was not a lot of people talk about this, is that he was of Huguenot descendancy.
Yes.
His father was a Huguenot, which were the French Protestants that were expelled in the 1700s. And from some accounts, he was actually born with deformed legs.
I've read that.
And which would have affected him jumping out of the window, as you mentioned earlier, and as well as other things. But one thing that you didn't mention is a story about his nephew Gabriel, which next week, for those that are still watching, we'll be doing a movie review of The Patriot, which is loosely based off of the Swamp Fox as well as Daniel Morgan. Mel Gibson's son is named Gabriel in there, but there's a historical marker in South Carolina where it reads, when Captain John Nelson, sent by General Marion, January 1781, to Sandpit Road to reconnoiter, met Captain Bearfield and his Tories near White's Bridge. A sharp fight ensued. Lieutenant Gabriel Marion, nephew of General Marion, was captured and inhumanely shot about a quarter mile north of where the site is. And I'm not one for pop history, so to speak. But the Legends and Lies series that Fox did, where they talk about the Patriots and Morgan, they actually talk about that, and then how he was when they found out who he was, the loyalist Tories, they executed Gabriel because of that. Mentioning ancestors, I don't know if the 5th Regiment of Line, which later became consolidated with the 1st Regiment of Line right before the surrender, would have had anything to do with Marion, but it did have an ancestor in there. He was a sergeant in there.
That's fantastic. I think so many of us, the folks in the chat and you and me, I think, so many of us, if we sat down and presented our Revolutionary War ancestors, we're all going to be from about the same place.
Yeah.
I had ancestors in South Carolina and Virginia in that time period. Of course, with the Overmountain men as well here in North Carolina. It's just amazing. It always shocks me. It shouldn't, but it always shocks me how small this world is. When we talk about men like Francis Marion. Now, Francis Marion would somewhat inspire later folks. As we get into the 1860s, those people still knew those stories and knew people who had firsthand who had served with Francis Marion. And we get some Confederate raiders, that adopt that name. Captain J.J. Dickinson in Florida is one of them. He was called the Swamp Fox of Florida. Swamp Fox, not Flocks. Fox. Sorry. Swamp Fox of Florida. They still knew that heritage. And as I started off with, so many people don't know that heritage these days. And I'm just grateful that, you're digging into not only the 1860 history, but, the 1770s and 1780s as well, because people need to know this. They really do.
Right. Well, it's like we've been talking about for a couple of years, is that Southern history, which is American history, has been around since 1607. We let 4 years really define who we are, but we have so much more to be proud of as a culturally different people that makes us who we are. That these men inspired our ancestors, who inspired us. The reason why we do the chat, why we love history and keep on keeping on, is because of inspirations generations back. Hey, Moose, did you get that technical issue taken care of? No, you haven't,
No,
because your mic's muted.
I believe so, yes. It
Okay.
took some convincing. StreamYard is playing a bit of tough ball with us tonight, but we're at least live, and I have my other monitor up, making sure everything is staying strong.
I thought it was a Pop-Tart break.
No. He's on a diet from Pop-Tarts. Oh, speaking of, I put a comment out earlier today about the moose hunt coming up during National Reunion. We're going to do it differently this year. In the years past, we've threatened to shoot him with Nerf guns. Instead, what we're going to do is the best, worst picture of moose gets a prize at National Reunion. But Michael, I believe this was the painting you were talking about. Is that correct?
That's it right there. You have the officer. Marion was often described wearing this really interesting hat, even when he served as brigadier general, when he was promoted to brigadier general. And it was a hat he wore when he was with the Continental Line. And, it's described as being half charred and, not really in good shape. But he still continued to proudly wear that hat through the remainder of the war. And then you can see Oscar down there working at the fire, presumably roasting those sweet potatoes. And the British officer, is absolutely, I guess bumfuzzled. I can assume that Marion is pointing to sweet potatoes there on the table, even though that's not real clear in the painting or the pictures. But yes, they took that and they engraved that. It was on a South Carolina note very early on in the war, and then it was on the 1861 Confederate $10 note. So one of those fascinating pieces, and I've done 2 posts now about some of the iconography on Confederate banknotes, Confederate Treasury notes. There's a whole lot more stuff to go through, with different political figures and different Roman goddesses. Yep, that's the note. That's Minerva there on the right, and that's Hunter there on the left. And you can see the engraving there of that painting. Of that British officer getting his sweet potatoes. I don't think I've ever seen anything about who that officer was, and the story may be 100% made up. I mean, that's always the further back in history we go, the harder these sources are to come by to collaborate or corroborate, these different pieces. But it's a great story. It really is. And more folks need to hear about that. David asked if in the TV show that the actor Nielsen wore civilian garb, didn't Marion always fight in a uniform? I know he did fight in a uniform sometimes. I'm not 100% sure he wore it all the time. I can't answer that one. That could be true and it could not be true. But remember, Disney, whether we're talking about historical pieces like the Swamp Fox, or if we're talking about the Great Locomotive Chase or something, they take liberties just like they do now with historical stories. And, a lot of the stuff they tell comes from, the Grimm fairy tales, or, even with Hercules, that's just so bad as far as history goes, or not history, as far as the mythology goes.
Yeah.
But I mean, they take liberties, and all TV shows, you're going to talk about The Patriot, that takes a lot of liberties with the story. They've mashed all of these stories up to present to you a piece. And while we can decry Disney or whatever for doing that, look how many people that show grabbed the interest of. And we could go throughout time to Jeremiah Johnston and the Mountain Men and North and South and Gettysburg and the Blue and Gray and all of those things. It seems whenever we get a good film like Gettysburg, the interest in that time period peaks.
Right.
What we don't have right now are a whole lot of good revolutionary or war between the states movies coming out. We seem to be hitting that World War II Korea time period pretty hard. But
well, hopefully that'll change. Now a lot of the sculptures and stuff that I see or I've seen of Marion, he's wearing
Yeah.
one of these type hats, which I believe is like a light infantryman's hat with the Liberty,
Yep.
moon that's now on the South Carolina flag. Along with the palmetto, that's that Fort Moultrie. Well, no, it was Moultrie made Fort Sullivan out of palmetto things. So yeah, Revolutionary War does affect your life, everybody. So I believe it was Snow Island where they were.
Yep. Snow Island is where this island in that swamp that they had their base, and they knew the route how to get to that island. And best I recall from my reading is the British never captured that camp.
Well, is it still accessible?
Wasn't all that accessible then.
Yeah, well,
At least according to the British. That's a great question, and maybe somebody out there will know the answer to that.
well, I just know and I get it wasn't in like the Santee or the PD area, but I like in the Mississippi River. I know it'll change course, and what would have been an island at one point is now something at Oxbow Lake, or it's something that's completely
Depends on
gone.
earthquakes and hurricanes.
Right.
Much more hurricanes here in the deep South, in my section of the South, than earthquakes. But we do occasionally have an earthquake. Big Charleston earthquake 200 years ago.
Yeah, I was about to say I don't think we've had one here in Mississippi since 1812. Knock on wood.
Don't do that to me.
So Walter Kennedy said, did Disney do Song of the South? They did Song of the South. And let me say this, you can, if you want to watch old episodes of the Swamp Fox, Disney Swamp Fox, you can go on YouTube. And I think all episodes, I didn't go and look and see if I could find all 8. There were only 8 episodes, but I probably all of the episodes are online, and I encourage you to watch them. Don't take their history for gospel, but go check it out. Song of the South, I think you can occasionally find on YouTube in some places. Somebody will get a pirated copy and put it up, and then Disney will eventually figure it out and cry lawsuit, and they'll take it down.
Going back to his hat, did he wear a tail in his hat?
He did in the TV show.
Yeah, I know, and in the theme song.
And in the theme song.
Been singing that all day.
I don't know. You know what I said. What I read was that he wore that black leather hat the majority of the time, even though it was falling apart. And apparently he'd got it too close to a fire one night or something and had charred part of it. He still wore that hat. Most of the engravings that we have of Francis Marion show him with a nice proper hat for the time period, not something that was falling apart. But
the ones I've seen, he's wearing a bicorn, or even so much as, I believe that by the 1860s was called a chapeau. Really, and that appears, and he looks like he's older in age. Than he
well, he was not a young guy,
right?
He was. He's in his 40s by the time the Revolutionary War breaks out, and while that's not old. Now, he was, being in the military is for young men. War is for young men, and Francis Marion would have been pretty old by that point in time. Look at the ages of most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And them guys were in their late 20s and early 30s. Not all. Some of them are older, but a lot of those guys are really, really young. And that just, at times we wonder, this is no offense against y'all, but sometimes I wonder about young people these days. Where are those types of leaders like Jefferson, who was, late 20s, early 30s? Where are those types of young men? Nathaniel Macon and Charles Pinckney, and we need more of those folks, because they're the ones who really stepped into the role of revolutionaries and set up this new experiment, which some days doesn't seem like it's going so well, but
our views and opinions. I just found this, and I shared in the website. It's Clarendon Murals. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But it's about deals with the Southern Campaign as well as the Francis Marion Trail. I didn't realize it, but he was in 53 different skirmishes.
That's the ones we know about.
Right. Which is a lot of hard fighting. You don't.
Yeah.
I mean, that is, especially, what are the year ranges on there? Let me pull it up. Known battles and skirmishes in 1871 alone.
1781.
Sorry, my list.
You do the same thing I do.
Moose would have done the same thing.
Yes.
But like over half of these dots on here on the map are where Marion actually led.
Yes.
Which is very, very, very significant.
Yes.
And
that's just 1 year. That's just 1781.
Right. And earlier we were kind of having a sidebar in the chat a minute ago with one of our sponsors, who we'll get to here in a second, Walter D. Donnie Kennedy. He was asking who would, if we were to compare Marion to a Confederate leader, who would be the closest comparison? And I said either Forrest or Mosby. What do you think, Michael?
I like Mosby, J.J. Dixon in Florida, which nobody ever talks about. I think Forrest commanded too many men. It's much more Mosby and Dickinson, Dixon, sorry, J.J. Dixon. And, you know, I think when you get to the Forrest and the John Hunt Morgan level,
Yeah.
you know, that's, you know, they've got brigades and artillery. I don't think Marion ever had artillery. Mosby did have some, and I think Dixon had some when he sunk that ship, federal transport ship there in the St. Johns River near Palatka. But you know, I when I think of Marion, I think of a smaller scale style of guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
Than I do between Forrest and John Hunt Morgan.
Yeah. And going back on the Mosby comparison, I mean, one could almost say at least the historical pop history, Hollywood history that everybody, you know, talks about as far as even the Disney one does, between Tarleton and Mosby could be akin to, or Tarleton and Marion could be akin to the Custer Mosby of the Valley Campaign in '64.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a fair assessment. I really do.
Well, speaking of the Kennedys and them being a sponsor and us needing to take a Pop-Tart break, even though Moose is not allowed to have any. Moose, who's our sponsor for this part of the season?
Well, our sponsor tonight is the Kennedy twins' new book, Jefferson Davis and the High Road to Emancipation and Constitutional Government. This book is about how Jefferson Davis was a leader to the high road to emancipation and how he looked for a day in which slaves would be able to participate and live in society. He did more, though, than advocate for this high road to emancipation. He practiced his beliefs in the ultimate emancipation of Southern slaves, and many of his former slaves left for prosperity and their testimony about their former master who prepared them to be a member of society. You can get Jefferson Davis and the High Road to Emancipation and Constitutional Government at www.kennedytwins.com and most online bookstores. The link is in the chat. And
also on scv.org.
Oh, yeah, that too.
And there are pictures in the book.
Very lovely pictures.
All right, Moose, what video you want to play tonight?
Let's see here. Let's get April off with none other than R.E. Lee, shall we?
When my mother was in college, she danced with Confederate veterans. To me, it wasn't that far away. You know, my father knew this. My mother knew this. Almost 50 years ago, I joined the Sons of Confederate Veterans. In those days, we weren't concerned about saving monuments or any of those things. That wasn't necessary. In fact, none of us had any remote idea that it would ever come up. We can't just sit there and react. We have to be proactive. Or, as Robert E. Lee said, the best way to disrupt your enemy's plans is to strike first. Everyone should do all in his power to collect and disseminate the truth, in the hope that it may find a place in history and descend to posterity. History is not the relation of campaigns and battles and generals or other individuals, but that which shows the principles for which the South contended and which justified her struggle for those principles. If you're looking for some place to be where you think you're going to accomplish something to save our history, go to the Sons of Confederate Veterans. I'm Thomas Lee Jesse. I'm a descendant of Private Daughtery Gilmer, a Confederate veteran.
And once again, that Pop-Tart break is sponsored by the Kennedy twins' new book, Jefferson Davis, The High Road to Emancipation and Constitutional Government, available in paperback, hardback, electronic, and you can get these at www.kennedytwins.com and most online bookstores,
including scv.org. So one thing that we talked briefly about his time going, after the war, and being in politics, so to speak. One thing I found very interesting about Marion is the fact that he actually, when in the I guess it was the state house, or serving. He helped rewrite South Carolina's Constitution, I believe in 1790. But also after the war, he was one of the proponents for not punishing the loyalists and stripping them of their property.
And that's one of the big debates, and it eventually winds up in the new U.S. Supreme Court. But I mean, various state courts handle that as well, take up that about what to do with all of these citizens, maybe up to a third of the population in the various states that didn't support the Patriot side of the war. We know, of course, some of those folks go to Canada after the war is over. In fact, I met someone recently, maybe within the past month, who was down here visiting in North Carolina, and that's what his ancestor did. That's how he got to Canada, was after the American Revolution. They went there, got shipped there, and big debate, about the confiscation of property, and that actually takes place after the war between the states as well. Especially in East Tennessee, there's a whole big long debate about the confiscation of property of people who were deemed rebellious to the United States government in the 1860s. But yeah, Francis Marion got into that as well. I saw someone post, I think it was Lori, mentioned Mance Jolly. And that's, I had to refresh myself really quick because I had heard the name. Mance Jolly really kind of, after the war was over, really went back to his hometown and started killing Union soldiers in a retaliation for his brothers who had died in the war. Maybe another example that some of our watchers and listeners may be familiar with is Champ Ferguson. Champ Ferguson got executed after the war for some of his, quote, guerrilla activities. And I'd kind of like to know, and I don't have an answer for this, I'd kind of like to know that defining line. Of course, our ancestors were not successful in their bid for independence, but, how did Dickinson not get executed and Champ Ferguson did? I don't know. That's a great question. I probably shouldn't bring up questions I can't answer when we're online on the air. But yes, Francis Marion did advocate not being harsh on those folks, families who had supported the loyalists, or who were loyalists, who had supported the British during the war.
Well, which is very speaks highly of his character, even though he's already in the American pantheon, so to speak.
Yes.
Thanks to Arthur Weems, who also wrote the George Washington cherry tree story.
Yeah. The
but
problem is, with Weems is it comes out so early,
right,
1800, and everybody just kind of builds upon that until we get to mid 20th century when historians start taking a little bit more of a critical look. That's why I mentioned Hugh Rankin in his book.
right.
And there's several newer ones. I think there were 2 done in the 2000s.
Yeah,
Newer biographies.
And I'm willing to bet that the interest in the Patriot had something to do with that.
Maybe so.
But the fact that the man had his entire estate and everything burnt, essentially taken from him when the war ends, but he still wanted to be magnanimous and having peace with his former neighbors. Because like we discussed in our episode on Kings Mountain, it was a proverbial, literal civil war almost. Hate that term, but I mean that's kind of what it was.
It's very true. That's very true. Like in Western North Carolina and North Alabama and Eastern Tennessee, it is an absolute civil war. In fact, at times it's even worse than that. I mean, just law and order completely breaks down.
Right.
It's just horrible.
Which it's kind of that way during, at least with the Patriot militia versus the Loyalist militias in the Carolinas during the Revolution. The fact that all this happened, that his nephew was sought or was purposely executed, the fact that his plantation, everything, he lost everything that he had leading up to the war, still being that magnanimous is just it speaks very highly to his character, and is one reason why our ancestors ultimately idealized him.
Mm-hmm. A lot to look up to there. I mean, just the privations that they went through, and then that feeling of reconciliation. There's your 5-cent word for the evening. Reconciliation after the war was over.
Well, we're good as long as we don't ask Moose to spell it.
Please don't.
Okay, Moose, I'm not sure I could spell that the first try.
He's Googling it right now. Oh, goodness.
Judging me right now.
Yeah, goodness gracious. No, Conroe's not judging. Anyway. Well, Michael, I appreciate you being on. Remind us one more time about your website and blog again.
You can find me online, michaelchardy.com. That's where my books and everything are at. I have a blog, long-time blog. The only Confederate blog out there is called Looking for the Confederate War, and I post on that 2 or 3 times a month. And I'm out and about speaking from time to time. I'm busy right now working on a book about the Battle of Plymouth, North Carolina, and but I'm out and about from time to time, and I look forward to seeing some of y'all. I was at a camp in Kingsport, Tennessee about a week and a half ago, and look forward to getting out and chatting with folks in person.
Yeah, I saw that where you were out and about on Facebook. And of course, you can check out his Sunday evening live historical streams, which he does a superb job on. What's that? And that's Eastern time. That's
8:30 Eastern time. It's got its own page. It's called Sunday Night History Chat.
So y'all look it up. Y'all follow him. Guys, we'll be back next week. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. We'll be talking about the Patriot, which again is loosely based off of the Swamp Fox, as well as Daniel Morgan, who we'll have to do a video on at some point, as well as some others. That'll be next Monday. I was about to say next Wednesday. Next Monday at 7 o'clock. This Thursday, we have Commander's Comments with Moose and Commander-in-Chief Jason Boshears. We're working on getting our website finished and possibly checking to see if StreamYard has us connecting to Rumble yet. It might not. Who knows? So that y'all can find us. We're also looking into potentially Roku. So if you have Roku device like we do here at my house, then you can sit there on the comfort of your couch and watch SCV Chat. But a lot of more great things to come with the rest of this season. Guys, remember, April is Confederate Heritage Month. Go out there, celebrate your history, your heritage. Your history and heritage is more than 4 years. It's 1607 all the way to today with your heartbeat. Remember, guys, that their SCV is always in needing of donations. You can go to scv.org and click on the donate, especially with things happening with the recent storms in Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas, the disaster relief fund, the museum fund, all sorts of things. And if anybody has $6,000 laying around, I found a copy of original copy of brigade level original copy of General Lee's Order Number 9 that would look great hanging in my office. So if you're interested in that link, I'll send it to you.
Does it at least go to the museum after, the end of your lovely life?
It's actually going to go to the museum, immediately after somebody buys it. But it's still very cool. Remember to check out all of our spin-off shows, Alamo City Guard Chat, look around Southwest Florida, and whatever ventures Vinny's on now.
And make sure you check in the Dr. Freeman group, David Pope's Friday Night Live, 8 p.m. Eastern Time.
So we will be back next Monday, or actually, Moose will be back Thursday at 7 o'clock.
Back Thursday, and we might. I might do something small Wednesday. We'll see how the good week is treating me by that time.
Anyway, guys, in the words of the late and great Harold Philpotts, no Fumar in the elevator.
Fumar in the elevator.